All right, hi everybody. All right, is this loud enough for everybody? Can you hear okay? Yeah, okay. Thanks for coming to Lost Inwood tonight. I'm trying something new, so I have this gadget on my head. People have been asking us for years, do you ever record your shows? And I have no idea how to do it, so I'm experimenting tonight. Wearing a headset is part of the experiment. Anyway, I hope it goes well because I think it's going to be a fun talk. And thanks for coming. Cole and I do this every month for the last almost 11 years now. And we keep coming up with new stuff, and tonight is new stuff. We also have some books. Cole and I wrote a book last year about Inwood, so a lot of you have it already, but if you don't, we have them for sale here for $20. Anyway, okay, so let's discover what the buying, selling, and building of Inwood means. The subheading is Real Estate Speculation and Urban Planning in Upper Manhattan during the 1800s. Very scholarly sounding, but we're also going to have some new discoveries about the origin of our neighborhood's name. And that's kind of cool. I love the discovery part. So I'm going to start with a quote which historians are always butting their heads against. The history that we discover is uncertainty, really. So we can get it as close to the point where the imperfections of people who've talked about things in the past and the inadequacies of what we can actually find meet. So this is a definition that I like. History is that certainty produced at the point where the imperfections of memory of someone who's died meet the inadequacies of documentation. So history is an imperfect science or art, but this is what we're going to cover tonight, and we'll cover it fairly quickly. But we're just going to talk about land in Upper Manhattan, and we're going to follow its usage and sale and the impact that it's had on people who've lived here. So we start with the people who lived here first, the Lenape. And then the Dutch arrived, and then the British, and then after the war, we were a rural farming community. And then a commuter arrived in Inwood, and that was the beginning of the urbanization, although it wasn't realized for a long time after that. And of course, one commuter leads to many commuters, and that leads to speculative sales of Inwood real estate. And the speculative sales of Inwood real estate caused City Hall to take notice and say, hey, we don't even have a plan for what's supposed to be up there. I think we should plan it before it's all sold and it's chaos. And then we'll take a little intermission because that's when we see the word Inwood being used for our neighborhood, and we'll talk about what we've learned in the last few months. And then the part two of the talk is the Central Park commissioners who actually succeeded. They were tasked in creating an uptown street layout, how they did it. And then as soon as they did it, the speculation just went nuts, and Inwood was sold in 7 huge sales. So after the 7 huge sales, we go back to imagining we're a farming community for a while they sort of start to work on infrastructure, the Harlem River improvement and all that stuff. And eventually, streetcars, subways, apartment buildings all arrive, and with them, a population, goes through the roof. And at the end, we'll talk a little bit about what neighborhood involvement has, how it has affected Inwood's growth through the centuries. And we know how it's affected our current situation, but it's not something new. All right. So Lenape land usage. This is usage that goes back thousands of years. We can see that, and these are all documented by archaeological findings. Let's see, I'm going to use this digital cursor now. I'm going to go back. And I'm going to try the digital cursor again. There it is. Okay, so we see fishing. And this was an archaic settlement at Tubby Hook. So this is the oldest settlement that we've found in our neighborhood. People got into the island through the waiting place up by 230th Street here. And then the road that is Broadway is just a footpath that was well used for many hundreds, if not thousands of years by the Lenape. Yeah? Oh, these are Lenape names that Reginald Bolton wrote on this map. So Muskota is our sort of area, but Shrockapok and Paparinaman, and this is Kingsbridge, Nicknison, and let's go on. Big land deal in 1626 is documented in the Shoggun Brief, which was a letter back to the home office of the Dutch West India Company by Peter Shagan, a representative, in which, in just a few sentences, not even a few sentences, he, in an offhand way, says, they have purchased the island of Manhattan from the Indians for a value of 60 guilders. This is one of the most famous documents that we ever hear about in New York City. And it wasn't really even a document, and it may not have represented anything that happened here in our neighborhood, because we can see, according to legend, our Shrockapok plaque attributes the transaction happening up here. It probably didn't. Yeah, the people lived downtown. But shortly after New Amsterdam got started, now the Lenape are still living up here when this map is created. And so these are virtual farm lines for virtual settlers. And they did get purchased by the Dyckmans and Nagels. These plots here, we'll see. And we can see the old Broadway. We'll see that again. It didn't get changed till during the Revolutionary War. Went to the East River before heading up and out. So these are land grants. And so these are the first guys who tried to live up here and farm the land, and they were established under Director Kieft. So the Jansen and Artson grant from 1647, Tobias Tennyson, we'll hear about him a little more later, from the 1640s. He bought his land from Kieft, and Matthias Jansen, 1646, up in the Marble Hill in the very topmost part of Inwood. Tennyson was killed in the 1655 Peachtree War with not the Lenape, I can't remember, but it's with the Native Americans it was a complicated political situation. And he was killed, and a lot of people were killed up here. And after that, people didn't want to come back for a while. So Tennyson's family left and wouldn't come back, and so the farm was awarded again to the Jan Dyckman and Jan Nagel in 1677. The ferryman who was in charge of ferrying people on and off the island, Johannes Verwielen, he owned the top part of the island. And this earlier land grant was still it was still operating. Anyway, a guy named Vermilya, and a guy named Bach also were awarded land up here, but they sold it immediately to Dyckman and Nagel. So that increased their holdings to double, and they teamed up. So they actually had 4 farms up here. And then when the Revolutionary War happened, I love this image because it actually could see the fields that were here. This is a 1777 map, and it has some mislabeled bridges on it, but I love the fact that you can see fence lines and fields, and this is the way it was. And the Dyckmans originally lived right around here and with the Nagels. And the Dyckman farmhouse at that time, which was the 1600s version, was destroyed during the Revolution, and then they rebuilt here or wherever 204th Street is on this map. I love this language. So, an early way of getting out of Manhattan meant following the instructions on how to take the road. All right, just imagine this. And leaving ye swamp on ye right hand as your road is now unto the, this is from 1707, but and so this is the text. The road is now unto Nagel and Dyckman's Run, and from thence, as ye way now lies, leaving ye fence on ye left hand, through the ground of ye said Nagel and Dyckman, by the house which ye said Dyckman doth now live, and over his bridge, and so forward, as ye road is now unto Kingsbridge. From ye bridge, by ye halfway house, ye rode to turn to ye right, and so over the ridge, over the creek to Harlem, and from Harlem, by ye lane as it now lies. And that is just to get you from here to here. But that's the way people talk. This would have been perfectly understandable in those days, 1707. No cell phones. Anyway, so here's how Broadway changed, and it was during the Revolutionary War. It's probably because Broadway was a desire line. The desire line to get to the island without all these instructions, you could just go straight and then off the island. And so by the end of the Revolutionary War, the pathway, the Dyckman house had been burned. No reason to have it here, so the pathway was here, and the Dyckmans rebuilt here on the new Broadway. And after that, we go back into, we continue our agricultural slow lifestyle. This is a agricultural census from the 1850s about who lived in Inwood and who, this is actually the population. The agricultural is next. We can see that we're averaging a little over 110, 115, 125 people in the neighborhood, 1790 to 1850. That's about what you could imagine being supported by farms. Yes. These are from census. These are from the national census, and you can see that until the 1820 census, there were enslaved people counted on the census in New York State. All right, so around 1819, John Randall Jr. Surveyed the rest of Manhattan. We'll hear a little bit more about his story later, but this is the farmhouse, and Kingsbridge Road is obviously Broadway. Corner of 204th Street and Cooper Street almost matches the fence line. And here's the farmhouse here. Much as it looks today, except for the stable and the cider mill and the barn. So in 1818, after Alexander Hamilton was killed, they, of course, lived in the Grange up in the Heights, and Elizabeth Schuyler Hamilton and Jacobus Dyckman and a few other landowners started a school. There weren't that many kids up here, but there was no school above 155th Street. So here is the Hamilton Free School, lasted about 40 years, and from these school board reports, they average about 15 kids a day. Imagine, that's above 155th Street. Just 15 kids of school age that were going to school. And here's an average, here's the only farm I could find data for, the Dyckman Farm. In 1855, 93 acres of land. They had 16 acres of corn planted, 4 acres of potatoes, an acre of turnips, a lot of hay, a lot of bushels of onions, and 10 acres of pasture land for livestock. It doesn't look like many people are living in Inwood, but downtown, population was really skyrocketing. Look at this Manhattan population, 1800, 60,000 people. 10 years later, it's 30% more. 20 years later, it's 100%, it's doubled since 1800. And in 1840, it is quintupled in 40 years. Anyway, that made City Hall come to attention as far as organizing and planning out their city. So in 1807, they appointed 3 men to come up with a plan for people living above where the city was at that time, trying to plan into the future, and they came up with this grid, although it doesn't show it in Inwood, but they came up with a grid system, rectangular plan that was to permit the most economical subdivision of land into nice, convenient, rectangular building lots. And since, as the commission said, rectangular houses were the cheapest to build, most convenient to live in, and so they planned cross streets that were the crosstown streets 200 feet apart, and that were blocks that could be divided into 25 by 100-foot building lots, a size that had already become standard. And then they made some exceptions in some wider streets and a few avenues, 12 numbered avenues, wider, 100 feet wide, running parallel. And they decided, they could decide how far up they wanted to lay out the land. And in 1811, they decided not to ignore the top of the island. And they wrote in their final report, to some it may be a matter of surprise that the whole island has not been laid out as a city. Why? Because it is improbable that for centuries to come, the grounds north of the Harlem Flat will be covered with houses. Oops. So after they released their plan, they did hire John Randall to survey all of Manhattan Island. He did one of the most amazing things a surveyor has ever done on this island. He produced in, I think, 90 some odd watercolors, a surveyed map of Manhattan at the time. And so it's amazing. It lists the landowners. It has all the buildings and the fields, and it has some topographical features. So taking a look at this 1819 snapshot of Inwood, we can see these landowners here. Jacobus Dyckman and Dennis Post are the biggest owners. Henry Post, John Bolton, Curtis Bolton, and George Hall, they owned land together. Jacob Hyatt, who I think had the tavern over here. Henry Thyssen and Abraham Dyckman, more Dyckmans. And then in these swampy lands, there are tiny little, there are other landowners that I'm probably just early speculating that won't be swampland forever. So we can see the Dyckman farmhouse right there. And look at, there's nothing around it except for the Nagels right here. Uh-oh, but in the 1840s, there's a new face, and he's not a farmer. Samuel Thompson, tastemaker, trendsetter, builder, contractor, architect, and Inwood's first commuter. He buys land from the Dyckman brothers in about 1835. And around 1840, he becomes the first commuter. He rode his horse and carriage into town, builds a lavish home up at the overlook, and soon other captains of commerce followed and built their own summer mansions on top of Inwood Hill. In 1844, he founded the Mount Washington Presbyterian Church, Inwood's first church. The congregation is still on Vermilion at 204th Street. But he wasn't here very long, not even 10 years. He suffered a stroke in 1849 while visiting a construction site near Dyckman Street where his son was building a few houses. And he died 6 months later up on top of Inwood Hill at his home at age 65. His wife and 10 children survived him. And the house was eventually demolished in 1899 to make room for the House of Mercy. So he and his son could be considered the first real estate developers in Inwood because they built the first house and then they built the first investment houses.
A church?
And a church, yeah. After purchasing the land, the first thing he did was to build a dock, probably to get the raw materials to his building site, which he finished in the summer of 1835 while he was living in Spuyten Duyvil. And we'll hear more about that later. And then he continued to develop and maintain that dock. One of the terms that the Dyckmans insisted on was that he allow people to access a ledge on his property where they would be able to enjoy the panoramic view of the Palisades. I think that's pretty cool. And he did build this pergola. I wonder if that's where the public could go. It's right up at the overlook. And here's an 1847 map from the water. And we're looking at this boat, the Iron Witch, is heading north up the Hudson, and we see Spuyten Duyvil. And 1847, there's one house, and you can see it's called Thompson. And there's Tubby Hook. You can even sort of see there's some other building there. It might be the store that the Veaches ran, and then Fort Tryon. And here's the mansion that he built. Funny, right when he built it, he had to build it twice, because right when he finished building it the first time, the roof leaked. He hired a tinsmith. Tinsmith investigated the roof and poured some things on it, and the whole place caught fire and burned down, and he had to build it again. I hate when that happens. So this has got to be the second version. And there's the pergola that the public was that's where the public was invited to view the Hudson. But when we were researching our book last year, I went up to see Jeff Carter, who's a descendant of Thompson, and he has a lot of stuff. All these paintings of Thompson come from Jeff's collection. They're up on his wall. He's a carpenter. He built a house, his own house, that kind of looks like this. And here's Samuel Thompson's Bible that he probably used when he went to the Mount Washington Presbyterian Church. The last thing that stood of his estate was the gatehouse. It lasted long enough for this photo to be taken in sometime after 1900. It remained standing into the 1920s. And here's his death notice. Thanks for a lot of this material to Jeff Carter. There's a town called Red Hook way up the Hudson someplace. Yeah, he lives around there. Yeah. So what would it have looked like to be living in the Thompson house and looking at the Hudson River? This is a little bit later, but this is south from Thompson's Pier. This is published in the Knickerbocker magazine on top. And then looking north from Fort Tryon, there's the store, Tubby Hook Depot store and pier. At Inwood Hill, it would be this in the distance. And Fort Tryon, these are actually, that's artistic license to make it look like the Adirondacks. What is it? The peak of Manhattan is 200 and some feet, I think. Okay, but a big thing happens in 1849. The railroad opens. On September 30th, the Hudson River Railroad opened for business from downtown New York City, initially to Peekskill. That was the initial run when it opened in September 1849. And within a couple of years, they'd finished their service to Albany. And the New York Public Library has all of the executive meetings, records of their records. And that's how it's been hard for me to track down the date that it opened. I went down to the library. In the rare books, you could see the signatures of Vanderbilts and stuff. They were the people running this railroad. And until 1871, our Tubby Hook station here provided regular service downtown. So this is actually accommodated the first commuting population in our neighborhood. This is a photo of circa 1900. You can see there's where the George Washington Bridge is going to be. And that is Dyckman Street looking east. Thanks to Veach descendant Jason Covert. So thank goodness Upper Manhattan didn't look like this, but this is all they had at the time. They knew that streets were supposed to be 100 or some odd feet apart, and they could just do the calculations and get all the way up to the top of the island. And so that's what speculators used as their own grid if they needed to sell things. And Andrew Green in 1866, we'll hear more about him later, says the lines of streets that do not exist above 155th Street are continually used as boundaries of the transfer of land. I'm really glad they didn't level it to get that grid up here. But in 1859, land speculation did reach Inwood, and this is the old Dennis Post property. And we don't really have to read this, but if any of you went to the greatest grid exhibit at the Museum of the City of New York in 2011, this map was actually on display. And some of the highlights that they have to say are that this banal subdivision plan reflects the lure of speculation. The area was beyond the reach of the commissioner's plan. And to put it nicely, this map is just aspirational. And when the commissioners stopped the grid at 155th Street, their aim was to subvert this kind of speculation on land that they thought unamenable to development. But this map confirmed their fears. And this property was actually sold. It took a couple of sales to do it. And so this sort of got locked into the grid. It didn't get changed. So these streets that are sort of adhering to the strict grid of downtown, even though it's the transit yard mostly today, these streets east of Broadway they are mathematically consistent with the downtown grid. So when a guy made a map in 1867, he put this grid on it. He gridded out the streets just where the Dennis Post sale took place. And here's the ad for it, that sale for the second sale in 1860. And as we'll see, you can see a little bit of the layout also here around Tubby Hook, because that's the only other sale that happened before the plan was made completely up here. Story to come later. Anyway, so these sales are setting alarms up in City Hall, and the city just knows it needs to address the need for a plan uptown. It took 3 tries. In the first attempt, they just told someone to do it, and they didn't allocate any money. So the Common Council of the city directed the street commissioner present a plan. No, there's no budget for this. So they made no plan. And beyond a few meetings, accomplished nothing, according to Andrew Haswell Green. And, you need a budget to do a big plan. So the second attempt was the one that I knew least about, But I made this really cool discovery in this article from the New York Herald in 1860. So in 1860, a 6-man commission of wealthy uptown landowners, they were commissioned to do it. And we can see here the names of the people. The people who we would know who were in this commission of laying out the land were Isaac Dyckman and John Seaman, both Inwood people, both wealthy people. And they wanted to build 3 private parks encircled by scenic drives spanning the top of the island. And they wanted their parks to be called Fort Washington Park, Fort George Park, and Kingsbridge Park. And I'll read the highlighted part here now. It appears that they have decided to lay out all of that beautiful region into 3 parks, private parks, however, 3 different departments in the form of parks, but owned by the various private individuals and studded with demesnes and handsome villas. The first of these is to be called Fort Washington Park. The next division is to be called Fort George Park. And the third section will be called, we believe, Kingsbridge Park, and will run from Tubby Hook to Spuyten Duyvil, a peculiarly varied and picturesque region. So what they really want is castles and kingdoms. And so Fort Washington Park, there's the property with the scenic drive surrounding it. And Kingsbridge Park is a name for Inwood that I never knew about until I started working on this paper. And then Fort George, which even would go across the river, they said, we'll just open the high bridge for carriage traffic. So these would be self-governing. The people who own the land would decide where the roads go. Maybe they were just kicking the can down the road a little bit. But it didn't go over well with City Hall, apparently, because Kingsbridge Park, what? But Kingsbridge Park did become the name of the first post office in Inwood. And here we can see in September 1863, just shortly after they started these branch post offices, we can see the New York City post offices. What is this, the 14th one, the one highest on the island, Station N, is called Kingsbridge Park, or Tubby Hook. Kingsbridge Park. And this is the store, the Thompson store, which Veach ran later this is a long story about it being moved, but there it is at Tubby Hook. And Kingsbridge Park, 5 years later, is still the name of the post office. This time they say it's at 206th Street near 14th Avenue. And I'm looking at that, I'm thinking, that makes no sense. But if you use the old grid, it makes sense. 9th Avenue, we still have 9th Avenue and 10th Avenue in our neighborhood. And these avenues that are on this unused map give us 14th, and that says 205th Street, so 1 street higher. 206th and 14th Avenue brings you to Tubby Hook. Crazy. All right, so right around then, in 1863, the second big sale happens. And this is called a preemptory foreclosure sale. And it was this sale that got me going on the path of finding a little more about the history of the name Inwood. This says it's 150 building lots, and on eBay, I found a deed. It was sitting there forever. It was just called a deed for property on Inwood Hill, 1800s. And I thought, I can't read the handwriting in the first place. And so until I saw the date, it said 1863, and then I remembered, hey, Cole, I thought the train station changed to Inwood in 1864. What's the story here? So I
had thought that was an 1867 map.
Yeah, and so this is the sale, and I'll talk about it more later, but the deed refers to a map at City Hall, and I went to look at the map at City Hall, and this is the map for that sale, and you can barely see it, but we'll look at it closer later. It says Inwood. Anyway, the guy who was running the sale was George J.S. Thompson, and one of these houses is his up here. 1863. So why don't we talk about this now? Tubby Hook Station was renamed in Inwood in 1864. We know that, and we'll see the newspaper notices. We don't know why, but we're going to try and tease apart a couple possibilities. And before that, the neighborhood had all kinds of names, Sometimes in the census, we were Manhattanville. That's pretty far down. Sometimes Carmensville, that's closer to us. Mount Washington, we've heard about Tubby Hook. Tubbs Hook is in the Valentine's Manual for someone's address. The Out Ward was, yeah, Fort Tryon, Fort Washington, all interchangeable because the size of our neighborhood changed through time. If it was really, really big, we could be all Carmensville or Manhattanville. Kingsbridge Park is the only name that I've never heard of before, but it figured in that story. Anyway, here's the official notice that this was the limit of our knowledge up until recently. All over the place in November of 1864, newspapers broadcasted that the Tubby Hook Station has been changed to Inwood. The Tubby Hook Station, the name of the Tubby Hook Station has been changed to Inwood. Many newspapers broadcast this. And so why? Well, at least if you look at this deed, at least on paper, that at least one guy was calling the neighborhood Inwood. And on this deed, he says, all these lots that he's selling are laid down and known on a map of said property entitled Map of Part of Inwood in the 12th Ward of the City of New York, property of George J.S. Thompson, January 1st, 1853, which said map is on file in the office of the Register of the City and County of New York and numbered 208. I love going to the City of New York offices, and now I know where to look and what office to go to and the number of a map if it exists. So I went down there, and the guy said, we got like thousands and thousands of maps. I said, well, it's number 208. And he goes, oh, well, that's farmland. You're talking about farmland, because I guess they're chronological. But there it was in microfilm, boom, map of Inwood in the 12th Ward of the City of New York by George J.S. Thompson. It's from January 1st, 1863 to November of 1864. That is almost 2 years. And this is Dyckman Street, but wait, I've never heard of Hudson Avenue. And so if you think about it, it almost looks like he's announcing the name of a town. And this is the train station where people are going to go to get to work. And there's the store. And here's your town. And we're going to call this town Inwood. And I made up the word. And you're going to buy land there. I kind of think it's some spin and some real estate spin. But because we can't call him and ask him, we'll have to look for other forms of evidence. But it's amazing that he made a logo. It's beautiful. He put a romantic name to Dyckman Street, and he's given it this sort of generic but picturesque name, Inwood. Was it his idea? Well, William Calver, who is an archaeologist that a lot of us know about, he wrote in the Recollections of Northern Manhattan that a city court clerk was responsible for changing the neighborhood's name. He wrote, the name of Inwood, suggesting the ultra-rural character of the era, was bestowed upon it in the 1860s by a venerable clerk of one of our courts. So he told us himself to encourage its settlement by nature. All right, so you got me interested. Because now online you can search Valentine's manuals, and I'm guessing court clerks would be listed as city employees. So let's go look for city employees who were court clerks in 1864. And there's a guy named Thomas Veach, who's a court clerk in 1864. And the Veach family is somebody we know very well from the store and the photos that his great-great-great-grandson came and visited here. So could that be possible that Thomas Veach, a city court clerk in 1863 to 1864, and lived at Tubby Hook and was the father of Robert Veach? He was active in Tammany politics, also a jack of many trades, ran for the 17th District Assembly. He was an original trustee of the Dyckman Library, auctioneer, 12th Ward school trustee, election inspector. All these are sort of part-time jobs, but also a commissioner of deeds, a notary public, a court equity clerk, a recording clerk, chancery clerk, and county canvasser. And he sold land. Here's some ads for sale and to let. See Thomas Veach on Nassau Street. Thomas Veach on Nassau Street. That's his office. So I'm guessing he was taking the train to work. but he died young at age 45 in 1869. You can take the train to work at the Tubby Hook station. All right, so there's another possibility here. In 1865, prior to its name, let's just say what this magazine was. The historical magazine published this Tubby Hook station had changed name to Inwood, and then people wrote in letters to the editor about it. And this guy wrote in 1865 saying that, hey, Inwood, Judge James Whiting of Spuyten Duyvil, he called his home Inwood, and he wanted the Spuyten Duyvil post office to be called Inwood. He named his mansion Inwood, and he was a rich guy, but the Spuyten Duyvil postmaster refused. And he's taken the train downtown every day. So let's read the highlights. So the Hudson River terminology: the eye of the traveler on the Hudson River Railroad is occasionally attracted by a new signboard at a station, and his ear by a new call by the conductor. The latest transportation is that of time-honored but unromantic Tubby Hook into Inwood. And we go on to this next highlight. Some years ago, a similar attempt was made on Spuyten Duyvil in an effort to get its post office name changed, if we recollect aright, to Inwood, which, by the way, has been for many years the name of the fine estate of Judge Whiting near the station. But the Postmaster General took bold grounds against the innovation. What this tells me is that this name Inwood was on a lot of people's minds, or maybe on one person's mind, and on the train to work, he's telling all of his friends about it and moaning and stuff and saying, I tried to get the post office guy to change and he wouldn't. So what are our possibilities? Well, Samuel Thompson, he had died too early to really be a part of it, but he was the first guy to start this movement towards suburbanization. And then Judge Whiting, who lived at Spuyten Duyvil but called his mansion there Inwood, and he wanted it to change Spuyten Duyvil's name to Inwood, but was foiled by an uncooperative postmaster. He worked in the New York City court system as a judge, district attorney, and attorney. Thomas Veatch was a city Supreme Court clerk in 1864 and 1863, dabbled in uptown real estate, knew the local big shots, but died early. And then George J.S. Thompson, who put the word on the map, looks like a planned community, an audacious move to preempt our neighborhood from becoming Kingsbridge Park or Tubby Hook. But Thompson also died early. He passed away before the land was even sold. But they were all commuting downtown. So what is it? So we can imagine that in the room where it happened, people were talking about stuff. But we're never going to know for sure unless more data is out there. Anyway, people loved, now that Tubby Hook was gone, people loved it and wrote elegies about it. Down there on Old Manhattan, where the land sharks breed and fatten, they wiped out Tubby Hook, that famous promontory renowned in song and story, which time nor tempest shook, whose name for aye had been good, stands newly christened Inwood, and branded with the shame of some old rogue who passes by dint of aliases, afraid of his own name. Or this one, the eye on the traveler of the Hudson Rail. Well, actually, I'm going back. I want to go back. I figured it out. Okay, we already did that one. So this one, the son of Tubby Hook is set, 'tis Inwood now, and folks forget, in Puck Magazine. Or this note in the Brooklyn Daily Eagle, it is the spirit of iconoclasm that causes these changes of names from those of historic associations. For instance, that of Tubby Hook to Inwood, the one famous in Revolutionary days, and the latter as meaningless as the laughter of idiots. That is harsh. Okay, the city decides to bring in the professionals. The third attempt at laying out the streets begins in 1866, but in 1865, the state legislature authorizes the commissioners of Central Park to lay out the streets. Commissioners of Central Park as street layout people. How come? Well, these guys had developed a ton of experience in planning and administering an urban place. They were responsible for the forming and execution of the Central Park. And the commission lasted from 1857 to 1870, and just in the last 5 years, they worked on our streets. So I couldn't find a photo or image of Thomas Fields, but Andrew H. Green was the Treasury Comptroller. He's a guy we'll talk about a lot because he did most of the writing. He was the mouthpiece of their thoughts. Moses Grinnell, Henry Stibbons, and Thomas Fields. And they were responsible from about 1866 to 1869 for producing maps and actually surveying and laying things out above 155th Street. So the deal is, we saw in 1840 that the population was 300,000, and the earliest commissioners said it'd be centuries before people would be living uptown. But by 1860, we're already almost 1 million, and everybody is downtown on Manhattan. So in 1865 or 1866, here's some stats for what was above 155th Street. 1,700 acres of land, 4,000 people, 250 landowners. This is just what Andrew Green reported in his monumental essay. 350 houses, and about 120 of the homes would be in the way of the grid as it was. And 400 acres, biggest single landowner, Isaac Dyckman. And a varied topography from sea level marshes to the island's highest point at 271 feet. And in Andrew Green's essay, he writes and complains that in 1865 it was easier to commute way uptown into Westchester and above than to North Manhattan. Partly because Grand Central Station opened and the trains started running up the Bronx side as they do today, and so fewer trains ran up the Hudson River. Okay, this is the one slide of his bio. You really can't say it all in one thing because this guy did so much in his life. So he became a lawyer in 1854. He displayed his talents at administration and became president of the New York City Board of Ed, a member of the Central Park Commission, in which he not only helped form Central Park, but formed the plan of streets above 155th Street. He helped found the Museum of Natural History and the Metropolitan Museum and played a role in exposing the Boss Tweed Ring. As a city comptroller, his skills spared New York City or greatly aided New York City in escaping bankruptcy. He helped the New York Public Library put together its initial funding, a father in terms of philosophy and stuff of the consolidation of New York City boroughs, and also formed the American Scenic and Historic Preservation Society, which helped advocate for a lot of our uptown parks. But in 1866, after he had been appointed commissioner, he put all of his thoughts together in this very dense essay. 45-page masterwork on planning the layout of Manhattan above 155th Street. So basically, this is his position paper, and this is where he lays out what he thinks will work. He's also, if you look at the subtitle, he's got a lot of other stuff on his plate because he's doing highway, the old drives that they would survey from 59th Street to 155th. He was also doing the improvements on 6th and 7th Avenue from Central Park to the Harlem River. So he had so much on his plate in addition to Central Park. And this is all the while the newspapers were starting to say, this is from the Society pages in 1869. Fort Washington, Inwood, and Carmersville will be fashionable summer resorts for New Yorkers this summer. And Andrew Green says the exceeding picturesqueness of this part of the island have rendered it a favorite resort of much of the wealth and intelligence of the city. And with that easy access that the trains were providing, investors were flocking to North Manhattan. They faced big challenges, and these are Andrew Haswell Green quotes from that essay. The ground to be laid out is of an unusually difficult formation to arrange symmetrically. The ruggedness of large portions of its surface have stubbornly repelled repeated efforts to fix upon it a rectangular plan. The steep hills along the rivers preclude frequent cross passages, but investors saw a huge upside. The southernmost part of the territory is already being rapidly subdivided. People are already doing business above 155th Street as if the grid was in place. And the tendency to build above 155th Street has long demanded a plan for that ground. So you can see he's starting to lead himself somewhere, and he had many things to say. We're just going to talk about a few of these. And the big difference between the downtown grid and the uptown grid is this grid that he proposed was more sensitive to the topography of the upper island. He thought that more north-south avenues would be a good idea. And he also thought that altering the direction to fit Broadway and the high ground on the east and west, he could accommodate that by adding a bend to Dyckman Street. And then they produced 4 maps in 4-year sequence. These maps were really hard to track down. They're buried in the Central Park Commission annual reports. And these annual reports on Google Books, they scan the text, but they don't unfold the map. And so it says there's a map there, and you go to it, and you can see it folded up, and you can see nothing. Nothing. But so you have to look and look and look and look. I never found a scan of this one. Oh yeah, I did. Archive.org is another site that has scanned documents, and they did unfold the maps. So archive.org, Central Park, the annual reports of the commissioners of the Central Park, 1866, 67, 68, 69. So these highlighted areas are the parts that they were addressing each year, and we'll look at it closely soon. 1866, just part of Dyckman Street and really just the west part. 1867, they're going to do the east part of Dyckman, and they're going to lay out some of Washington Heights and some of I guess we would call it Fort Washington. Then in 1868, they're going to lay out Inwood below Dyckman, so Arden Street, Sickle Street, and then all the cross streets in Washington Heights. And then in 1869, all of Inwood appears. Boom. And there's a reason for that. This is what he envisioned when he said put a bend in Dyckman Street. You can see Fort George and Inwood Park, and Broadway is also bending there. And this is us, right? Yeah, Indian Road Cafe. So Broadway takes a turn and goes parallel and kind of goes right in between Fort George and Inwood Hill. And Andrew Haswell Green, when he said put a bend in Dyckman Street, it's so that he can change the grid to still be right angles and have those same lot sizes and keep it going a little further and use more space more efficiently. Okay, so now it's a race against time, because in 7 huge sales, most of Inwood gets sold, and in just over 10 years. So this bubble of speculation, bulk of Inwood's land was sold. Oh, I'll go back quick. So a lot of this was the Dyckmans. When the people who were living at the Dyckman house, they were already up here. They wanted to sell their land. They had 400 acres of land. So 1868 and 2 in 1870 and 1 in 1871, those 4 sales are all of Isaac Dyckman's land. And then there's 3 others. This is the George G.S. Thompson's land, and this is Dennis Post's, and this is something that if you ever go to the Tubby Hook Tavern, you see the poster on the wall. All right, here's the very first auction, 1859, taunting City Hall and saying we're using a grid that hasn't even been made. 50 acres east of Broadway, including the Nagel Cemetery and the African American Cemetery. Most of this is now the transit yard. And then in 1853, George G.S. Thompson puts Inwood up for sale, 20 acres in his planned community. And then in 1866, and this is right when the Central Park Commission was getting going, the top of Inwood Hill is sold, the northernmost part of the island, except for Marble Hill. 240 lots, previously owned by Jacobus Dyckman and Henry Post. for a lot of these acreages, if it's not on the poster, I use the Google Maps. You can make a polygon around a shape, and it'll tell you how many acres your polygon is. Okay, 1866, the route of Inwood Street is approved by the Central Park Commission, and it's this end here from Broadway to Tubby Hook. You can see in the dotted lines the old rutted path that would go to the river. There's the store, the street that went up. Here's the old carriage road that went up to Samuel Thompson's place. And the first Central Park Commission map with that part of Dyckman Street, that's laid out now. There are other things that are proposed but not confirmed at this point. And the original, you can see it very faintly, the original Central Park Commission also retained, I think that's 10th Avenue and Broadway, Kingsbridge Road. They said those won't change. So we're still going to have 10th Avenue and Broadway and work within that. So in the next year, 1867, the Central Park Commission approved the bend in Dyckman Street towards the Harlem River. So this was laid out and approved. It may be laid, and Green says it may be laid in a straight line from river to river, but a bend will probably be necessary. And that's what it looked like in the second map. You can see that they do have also, I'm just talking about Inwood, they've been doing a little bit of business down lower, mostly the big north-south avenues. And there's going to be this one, that land sale from up here, they were selling it as the terminus of the big West Side Highway drive. You know, it's not the West Side Highway, but there was going to be a grand highway going all the way around the island, which didn't happen, but it was on this property and they were using it to sell it. And then in 1868, the third map shows Elwood Street. It shows Hillside Avenue. It shows Nagel Avenue. It shows Sherman, as well as the cross streets here. And in 1868, now that we can see this, we'll take a closer look at this later, the part that's Inwood. This is a copy of the actual map that the surveyors on the ground were building. So we can see the first streets below Dyckman to be named are today Sherman, Nagel, Hillside, and Elwood. And that was just what the Dyckmans needed to know. So their first sale was that land and what had just been laid out on top of Fort George. And so the first thing that the Dyckmans did in 1868 was they sold the Hillside, Elwood, and now in 1868 it's called Sherman and Nagel and Elwood and Hillside. They all have names by October 14th, 1868. And now we'll have an option here. It's going to be called the Boulevard or Dyckman. And then they sold this land again. They flipped it. So in 1869, this 1866 sale, they sold it again. So that's the first example of flipping, I guess, of investment. Flip or flop. And in 1869, the Dyckman heirs, because by this time Isaac and Michael Dyckman had passed away, and their heirs were liquidating, they petitioned the commissioners of the Central Park to expedite laying out streets above Dyckman Street. And here's the little letter in their minutes. Petition of John H. Dyckman and other heirs of Isaac Dyckman are asking for the layout of streets and avenues upon the Dyckman estate. And it was referred to the Committee on Roads and Avenues, and later that year, when the map was published, they had done it. A votre service. On November 3rd, a map of the streets north of Inwood and Dyckman Street was unanimously approved. And that's what the final map of the Central Park Commission looked like. And that's what it looked like on the ground. I might as well say that we have this grid that's developed. And one thing that we can see about it is when they tilted Dyckman Street, they were able to get those right angle corners for another 5 or 6 blocks that we saw the photo of. And then this grid is the same as the downtown grid, same orientation. And they've also laid out a few streets on what would be Inwood Park, too. So that's what their surveyor's maps are looking like from 1869. Most of these things are measurement. Those numbers that we can't read are just measurements. Okay, that opened the floodgates, because now the Dyckmans have land that's laid out, and they can sell it and actually put their property on a map. So the following June, you can see where it is here, and here's the map that came with the auction brochure. I went and raided the Dyckman House collection. They are very good to me. And so this is what they sold. 92 acres, June 1st, 1870. And what we're talking about is the land immediately above Dyckman Street up to about 211th Street. This is the old Dennis Post land that had been sold a few years before. And then 209th, 211th, 205th. There's 207th Street, which was named Emerson, Hawthorne, and Academy. This is 204th now. And then just a few months after that, boom, another one. They're selling their land around Sherman Creek. Here we can see a smaller auction, just 40 acres of the land where the power plant is, up to 206th Street and over to Sherman Avenue. And then their final auction, the fourth and final Dyckman land auction, they sold the farmhouse right here on Broadway between Hawthorne Street. That's where the farmhouse would be. And so we could look up what lot numbers it was sold. It was 3 or 4 lots. 80 acres of land, a large auction. So we've just looked at that in a lot of detail, but this is what we saw. We saw 7 auctions. I don't know. This is where the family, the Eyshans didn't move. John Seaman didn't move. Even the Dyckmans didn't move. They built a mansion right across the street from us at Baker Field. There it is. Or actually, I don't know if that's it. That's where they were living. But they were going to build a mansion at Baker Field right around here. So these were still being owned by wealthy people. And these were all being sold too. I'm not mentioning them because they were too small a sale. I wanted to show the really big picture. So some of these were also sold in that same time. Might as well say this, because this is an important part of our uptown planning. The Central Park Commission also established and set aside some land for uptown parks. And in there, this map of the final Central Park Commission map that Sackersdorf released in 1872 has a Fort Washington Park set aside and a High Bridge Park set aside. Now, sometimes things come and go. It's not set in stone once it's there, because I don't see Fort Washington Park on every map. And then another thing happened, but first the Central Park Commission was dissolved in 1870 and sort of became the Department of Public Parks. And they did put out one more map in 1873 in which a lot of the cross streets here had been replaced by a parade ground. Like a fairground, a military place. And this is on a few maps. And here it shows up in the 1864 Department of Public Parks map from 1874. These streets are going to come back, though. But what they're kind of having in mind is the landowners are also applying some pressure. Here we can actually see in 1878, they've wiped out all the streets and published this map with a huge article about why you should buy land up here, real estate movements. And the text came from the 1869 New York Times article, but this map was published almost 10 years later. Real estate movements at the upper end of the island. Well, now that everybody's sold land, there still are, these were all just virtual streets on paper. There are no real streets here until they start to put in infrastructure. In 1874, they start to build the infrastructure underneath Dyckman Street from Tubby Hook to Broadway. And you can see this is the map of underground drains from 1874. The first thing we got to do is build the sewers before you can build anything else. There was some swampy land too, so they're also draining moisture out of there to try and get, this is actually, these are going to lead into Sherman Creek, these drains. You can see them leading all the way across. So first infrastructure, then make the landowners pay. And here where the landowners got big bills for infrastructure improvements. Isaac Michael Dyckman got two bills, one for $42,000 and one for $24,000 for improving Broadway from 155th Street to Spuyten Duyvil. The landowners paid. And then in 1882, Upper Broadway gets its first gravel paving. It had been mud before that. So this is a macadamizing. The macadam is different layers of stones of different sizes, of a precise sizes, and they keep down the dust and mud. So 3-inch stones underneath a layer of smaller than 1-inch stones. But I should say that we've been talking a lot about the Central Park Commission and Andrew Haswell Green, but they weren't the only urban planners. And Egbert Veal, a former engineer, he submitted a plan for Central Park. He was not the only planner to influence Uptown, and this map is more famous than any of those Central Park Commission maps. This is his sanitary and topographical map of the island of New York, published right when they were planning Uptown Manhattan, is all about underground water, groundwater, streams, rivers, which are so important when you're digging a foundation. So engineers still use this map today to consult if the building that has a leaky basement is leaky because there's a spring underneath it that was on Veal's map, or underground waterway. And he also, in his interest with water and health, made a second map in 1880, his Transvaal. The Transvaal meaning the area between all the valleys. So everything from 125th Street up and between river and river. He wanted it to be he wanted to make sure that the shipping canal was finished. And we can see on his map at least, the first planning of the cutting off of Spuyten Duyvil Creek to make possible commercial shipping traffic. And he says in his text that fleets of canal boats and barges fill the Hudson, yet when they arrive, there's a struggle for landing space. And boats and barges would be saved 25 miles if they could just get around the island from here. There's no reason why the entire grain and lumber trade can't be transacted at the upper end of the island too. And he says a canal 300 feet wide and 20 feet deep is going to be built, and it was, connecting the Hudson and the navigable waters of the Harlem. Some of these Erie Canal, or at least the commercial traffic that would come through here, they weren't even going to downtown Manhattan. They were trying to get out to the Long Island Sound and east. And so this is the map. This is the initial canal being finished in 1895. That's the Broadway Bridge, not the one that's there now, though, with Manhattan on the left. And Marble Hill, Manhattan on the right. And this is one of the homes that the Dyckmans had lived in for a little while. Okay, so now we've got streets and waterways. Now these landowners just need somebody to buy their land and build on it. And so it was a decades-long wait for the city to arrive. Development ideas came and went. Proposed 1883 World's Fair. We were going to do it. There was going to be a World's Fair in Inwood. The landowners were all behind it. They said, wow, if there's a World's Fair here, they'll finish the sewers. They'll put a train up here. But it was later canceled for lack of funding because we were way too far away from anywhere. 1911, proposed Wonderland amusement park was going to be Coney Island, right across the street from us at Baker Field. No, it didn't happen. But streetcars got up here in about 1902, and there were rumblings that a subway was on its way, and in 1904, newspapers announced Inwood's first two apartment buildings, Solano and Moneta. On Dyckman, just east of Broadway, there they are, all alone in Inwood. And here's the newspaper advertisement for high-class apartments at moderate rates. In March 1906, the Dyckman Street and 215th Street RT stations opened for intermittent service. They had already finished the 207th Street station, but you can see that Inwood is mostly an unbuilt landscape, and so shortly after they opened, they closed. So this is a story I've just learned, and there was no 191st Street station at the time. That didn't come till like 1914. So trains went express from 181st Street to 215th Street or 221st Street, which there's no station there now, but that was the end of the line at that time because they were still building up to Van Cortlandt for another year or two. And so we'll see a little bit more about that story. But imagine you've got the subway up here, but because there are no people, they're going express right by those stations. Very impressive picture of the road building happening on Arden Street there, and Sherman is the cross street we're seeing. These mountains of stone being blasted away, whole hillsides. That's the Mount Washington Church that Samuel Thompson built back in the 1840s, and in the distance are the Palisades of New Jersey. And so in 1911, the subways are here. They've been persuaded to actually run, and a building boom takes off. 1911, look at all this. This is around 1915. We can see the trolleys that started. We can also see huge empty lots. This is Broadway and 207th Street. And Fort George in the background. So the building of Inwood, Sanford Gaster's great thesis. I got a lot of population stuff from him, and he actually went through real estate atlases and put black rectangles on paper where buildings were in different Bromley atlases. And so we can see population around 7,000. Here's our built area. These are apartment buildings if they're black. In 1921, the population has doubled in 9 years, and we can see the buildings have about doubled. Even some here that are now on the rail yard, they were built and then demolished. In 1930, we are almost built. There are still some places not, but really we are mostly built by 1930. And if we look at the population, we can just see that as soon as the subway arrives in 1915, there's 7,000 people here in these census tracts, which takes us below Dyckman. You can see Dyckman is here. So the census, 1915, 7,500, 14,000 5 years later. It had doubled in 5 years. And then tripled 10 years later. And then up to 50,000 in 1940, and where it's pretty much leveled off, around 50,000 people in Inwood since then. So this was what we saw, this land speculation and then the building of the streets layouts and then the actual building of the streets on the ground and then the public transit arising turned us into a city almost overnight. There was still some shaming to do though, because some of these landowners, they didn't want to give land to the city that the city wanted for parks. And the first park in our neighborhood was Eyshan Park in 1912. And Andrew Haswell Green's 1870 plan, he had carved out space for some Fort Washington and High Bridge, but nothing above that. And in the 1890s, before he died, he advocated for Inwood Hill to become a park. After his death in 1903, others took up the cause. And at the dedication for Eyshan Park in 1912, George McEnany, the borough president for Manhattan at that time, advocated for a park on Inwood Hill. There are a lot of good quotes out there, but I'll just say this. He said, "It would be a crying shame if now, when the land is undeveloped and real estate is within reach, that the city loses all of this natural park ground. It is my desire that we gain more land to the west of Eyshan Park." And the city parks commissioner, Charles Stover, he had saltier language. "I'm going to make a plea for more land in this neighborhood, and there are men who own land here, right now, to hear me. I know of men who believe in giving libraries and hospitals, but cannot be prevailed upon to give a widow's mite of land for a park. I want this park to be a lake in a great parkway, a link between Central Park and Lower Riverside Drive to the foot of Inwood Hill and Spuyten Duyvil." And I mean, that did happen. We have an Inwood Park now. But for this last part of the talk, I just want to talk about people power. People power is not a new thing. Here in 1875, the neighborhood is ticked off that they still have a muddy main street while the streets downtown are paved. 10 years ago, they said, in the New York Herald, the inhabitants of Kingsbridge, Fort Washington, Inwood, and the neighboring communities made up their minds that they ought to have a public road. And they discussed, canvassed the subject. The locality is celebrated for its romantic and sylvan solitude and beauty, and the citizens thought it was only fair that this section of the city should reap the benefits of any improvements that might be made and that are being made downtown. So a surveyor was appointed to take charge of the proposed new road. 10 years have elapsed, and not a cobble has been turned. How about water? Downtown's getting water. Croton water became available in New York City around 1848, but 20 years later, uptown residents still didn't have it. So in 1863, they're petitioning the newspapers and the city council. The following resolutions were adopted: that the city has increased so rapidly in population, Croton water is a matter of absolute necessity, that the advantage and benefit of its inhabitants. Anyway, they got their water, and they built this tank, which used to have a huge water reservoir at the top. You pump water up high, and this would be like the water tank for the top of the island. Maybe it was here. I don't know where it was. Sometimes they let you into this, and it's just a big spiral staircase up to a couple of rooms at the top. So the tower pumped incoming Croton water up to an elevation high enough to supply the high-service elevation neighborhoods of North Manhattan. And in 1907, people were complaining that IRT that was supposed to come to Inwood was going express through it. Pressure from uptown residents helped lead to numerous improvements in this subway. First of all, they got 191st Street Station. They were urging the improvements of Riverside Drive. Here they're saying the extension of the local train service to Dyckman Street, which has been refused by the Public Service Commission on the ground that it is not needed. Come to the Washington Heights Taxpayers Association business meeting and exercise your right for civic action. They're also saying that the 181st Street elevators, there are not enough of them. They need additional elevators at 180. And this, I know that there still aren't enough. But this actually, they did succeed in this. And they succeeded in getting our subway to stop locally at all of our stops. And then the most recent example, since I'm just looking for a few right now, the 2018 rezoning plans are right now, they're not happening. And it is because of people power. But when we look at the road planning that the Central Park Commission did and Andrew Haswell Green proposed, we can see that not much needed to be changed. There have only been real minor adjustments since he planned it, which I guess means they did a good job, finally. And I think that is where we end. Thanks for coming. Wow, what a trip.